What's the difference between experts and novices? How do experts think differently? And how do they develop this ability to think differently? Hi, I'm Michael Correa, and this is Psych Exam Review. In the previous video, we saw that our working memory has well-established limitations. It can only hold a few items at once, it's easily weakened by cognitive loads, and it can only hold those items for a fairly short amount of time. But we also saw the solution to this problem, and this is what's known as chunking. This is where we pack information together. We create these dense packets, and each packet only counts as one item in our working memory. We saw an example of this with remembering letters, and then seeing that a familiar word allows us to remember many letters at once. It only counts as one item in our working memory. And then a familiar phrase might include several words and many more letters, and this still only counts as one item in our working memory capacity. So we can't really change the total number of items that we can hold, but what we can do is make each item a complex chunk of information. And then we store these chunks of information in our long-term memory. Now, the exciting insight here is that while working memory has these clearly established limitations, there's no known capacity limit for our long-term memory. You can feel your working memory fill up after just a few items, but nobody's long-term memory has ever been full. It's never reached the point where the only way they could learn something new was to forget something else. This is the key to expertise. It's not the case that experts just have better working memory capacity, that they can just hold more items. Instead, they've built up a vast number of complex chunks that are stored away in their long-term memory. This allows them to draw on a great deal of information with minimal strain, minimal effort. And this minimal strain means that they still have capacity left over in their working memory. So it's the development and automation of chunks that gives birth to expertise. By storing things away in your long-term memory, you free up working memory capacity. And this means that you now have the extra capacity to focus on something new, to notice new things that a novice might not notice. So this is what allows for higher order skills. This is how experts are able to engage in analysis or critique or creativity. You've experienced this yourself with reading. Initially, you struggled to make out individual letters, then individual words, but eventually the process became automatic. You have thousands and thousands of chunks stored away in your long-term memory that you can immediately use almost without effort. And what this means is that now, while you're reading a text, you can engage in higher order skills. You can actually think about it while you're reading. You might be asking questions at the same time, or you might start looking for symbols or motifs or characterization. You're even able to judge the quality of the work as you're reading it. This is something you've probably already done in the case of reading, but it's something that experts have done in their own domain. They have so many well-practiced chunks stored away in their long-term memory that they start using their working memory capacity for more complex types of thinking. And then all the bits of information that are stored away are so well connected to each other that when they find one relevant piece of information, suddenly they can bring forth a great deal of knowledge. In his book Peak, co-written with Robert Poole, Anders Ericsson, a renowned expert on expertise, has referred to this complex system of interconnected chunks as a mental representation. So experts have a refined and detailed mental representation for their area of expertise. And what this means is that they can use all of these interconnected chunks to manage the flow of information in and out of their working memory capacity. So to understand the role that these mental representations play in thinking, we'll look to a few studies on how experts are able to think differently because of this vast system of chunks. Some of the original studies on the memory of chess masters were conducted by Adrian de Groot in the 1940s, and these were taken up by Nobel laureate Herbert Simon and his colleague William Chase in the 1970s. And what Simon and Chase did was they put 12 to 24 pieces on a chessboard in an arrangement that you might see in an actual game, and then they showed this to participants, novice players, amateurs, and master chess players. They showed it to them for 5 seconds, and then they asked the players to recreate the arrangement. And what Simon and Chase found was that the chess masters were able to reproduce the majority of the pieces on most of the trials, whereas the novices were only able to correctly recall 4 to 5 pieces. Now, the performance of the novices fits really well with what we understand about working memory. Our working memory can only hold 4 to 5 items, and for the novices, each piece is an item, so they can only correctly place 4 to 5 pieces. But how are the experts able to recall a dozen or more? Well, Simon and Chase also interviewed the players, and they found that the masters weren't really thinking in terms of individual pieces. They were thinking in terms of chunks. They were recognizing patterns. So just looking at the board for a few seconds, they were immediately recognizing areas of strength or weakness. They were even thinking about possible moves or even counter moves to those moves. Now, you might say, what if the chess masters just have better memories? Maybe it's the case that they could hold 12 items in their working memory anyway. And so that's how they got really good at chess. They had great working memory, they applied it to chess, and it shouldn't be a surprise that they got really good at chess. That's possible. So how do we know that's not what's happening here? Well, Simon and Chase did a clever alteration to the structure of the task. What they did was they did it again, but this time they put the pieces in arrangements that would never happen in real gameplay. And suddenly, the expert performance dropped. Now it was comparable to the novices and amateurs. What they essentially did was they made all those chunks in the experts' memories useless because those arrangements weren't happening anymore. And so now, even the chess masters were back down to thinking in terms of one piece is one item in working memory. This study shows us the critical importance of a vast number of chunks stored away in long-term memory in order to enable expert performance. When those chunks were suddenly made irrelevant, expert performance disappeared as well. Simon and Chase estimated that chess grandmasters may have up to 50,000 chunks stored away in their long-term memory, ready to be pulled into use as soon as certain patterns appear on the board. This goes back to what Ericsson referred to as a complex mental representation. A chess grandmaster has a very complex mental representation for the game of chess. A novice may only have the way the pieces move and a few simple strategies or a couple openings. What this means is they aren't recognizing certain patterns when they occur. So the grandmaster is seeing things that the novice is completely unaware of. And this is not just the case for chess. This is true for any type of expertise. When you think about an expert musician, they're not thinking in terms of individual notes the way that a novice might be. Instead, they're seeing scales, they're seeing rhythms that they've practiced many times before. They're seeing patterns, they're seeing overall chord progressions of a piece. And this means that their mental representation is much higher quality than a novice's. So part of what the process of developing expertise is building a complex mental representation, refining what it is we can notice about the area that we're trying to become an expert in. So now the question is, how do we build this complex mental representation? How do we build the thousands and thousands of chunks that need to be created and then automated in order to enable expert performance? According to Anders Ericsson, the answer is through deliberate practice. So, what is deliberate practice? According to Ericsson, there are a number of standards that need to be met in order for something to truly be considered deliberate practice. So let's take a look at these. The first is that the field must have objective criteria for success. In other words, we need to be able to tell who's actually an expert. This is more easily the case in certain fields, like expert music performance or athletics, where it's fairly easy to establish who can perform well. In addition, these are fields that tend to have a history of established training methods that can be learned. Deliberate practice also means that the person is going outside their comfort zone. They're going beyond their present limits. This means that deliberate practice is often not very enjoyable in the moment because the person is trying to do something they can't yet do, and that means they're repeatedly making errors and failing. Deliberate practice also means that you have well-defined specific goals for the practice session. This means it can't just be vague ideas of overall improvement. Instead, it has to be about building or modifying very specific skills. The person's full attention and conscious effort needs to be engaged while the skill is being practiced. So mindless repetition does not count as deliberate practice. And finally, there needs to be immediate feedback and modifications that can be done in response to that feedback. This is what allows the person to change what they're doing in order to develop the new skill. So just how much deliberate practice is needed? Malcolm Gladwell has famously suggested the 10,000 hour rule, that it takes 10,000 hours to develop expertise. But Anders Ericsson disagrees with this characterization. He points out that it's not necessarily a set number of hours, and that's going to vary by field. And it's also dependent on the intensity of those hours. Mindless repetition for 10,000 hours is not going to turn you into an expert. So experts are able to think differently because they have more knowledge, and that knowledge is better practiced, it's better organized and integrated. And this complex mental representation gives them the ability to think about things that novices can't. Now, when we observe expert performance, they often make things look easy. And this is because they're so well practiced. But it hasn't actually been easy. What we're not seeing is the many, many hours of deliberate practice that went into building and then automating all those chunks of knowledge. This is why you can't learn to think like an expert overnight. Occasionally you see books making these sorts of promises, that you can think like a doctor, or think like a historian, or think like a psychologist. The fact of the matter is that you can't do that just by reading a book. There's a great deal of knowledge that needs to be built up and systematized over a very long period of time. Experts have worked on their mental representations for years, and it's something that has involved a lot of deliberate practice and a lot of focused effort. It's not something that will just spontaneously appear after a magical number of hours, or something that will happen after reading a book. The fact is, chess experts, doctors, expert musicians, anybody with expertise, the reason they have that expertise is because they put a lot of time into building this complex mental representation of a game of chess, or of the human body, or of a musical instrument. There's no shortcut to this kind of expertise. And anyone who tells you that there's an easy way to be an expert is lying. So now we should have a better understanding of how and why experts are able to think differently. And in the next video, we'll see how we can apply this to our own learning and studying. I hope you found this helpful. If so, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for watching.